My name is Vivian Cross and I am 35 years old, and this is finally, in full, the whole story, every hour of it exactly as it happened, and what I'm about to tell you is the most dangerous 48 hours of my professional life. And it started the way most disasters in my family always seem to start, with an empty chair, and it ended somewhere none of us, myself included, could have predicted when it began. 7 years ago, on the night I was formally recognized as a certified fraud examiner, one of fewer than 2,000 people admitted into that credential nationwide that year, my parents were not in the small banquet room where the regional chapter held its induction ceremony. They were 3 floors up, in the executive dining room of the same downtown building, toasting champagne to my younger brother Julian's promotion to managing partner of Cross Wealth Management, the investment advisory firm our grandfather had founded 60 years earlier. I found out where they were from a text message my mother sent at 7:52 that evening, 8 minutes before I was called up to receive my certificate, a message I have reread more times than I could ever count in the years since. It read, "Sweetheart, we are so proud of you, but you understand tonight is Julian's night, the whole board is here, we simply cannot leave. We'll take you to dinner this weekend to celebrate properly, promise. Yellow heart, I want you to hold that message in your mind for the next 10,000 words, because everything that follows, the whistleblower complaint, the 48-hour countdown, the forged signature with my own name on it sitting in a file cabinet 3 floors below where my parents were drinking champagne that night, the phone call in the middle of the night that could have ended with evidence destroyed and a lifetime of savings gone for good, all of it traces back to a family that had spent 35 years deciding, quietly and repeatedly, which of their children's milestones were worth showing up for, and which ones simply weren't. Before I take you into what happened, minute by minute, hour by hour, if you're new to this channel, hit subscribe now, because I promise you, this is not a story that eases you in gently. And if you've been here before, tell me in the comments right now where you're watching from, because by the end of tonight's story, some of you are going to need to sit quietly with what you just heard for a minute before you even type anything at all. Now let me take you back step by step, carefully, because you need to understand exactly what kind of family builds a fraud this large without any of its members fully admitting, even to themselves, what they were actually doing.
Cross Wealth Management was founded in 1961 by my grandfather, Harold Cross, a meticulous, conservative man who built the firm's 60-year reputation on a single unglamorous principle: never promise a client more than the market could reasonably deliver. By the time my father, Edward, inherited it in the late 1980s, the firm managed close to $400 million for a client base that skewed heavily toward retirees and small local pension funds across the region, teachers, firefighters, small business owners, the kind of clients who trusted Cross Wealth precisely because the firm had never once, in 60 years, been the subject of a single regulatory complaint. I was born first. Julian came 4 years later, and from almost the moment he could hold a conversation, it was clear he had the exact quality my father valued most in this business: an effortless, disarming charm that made anxious retirees feel instantly reassured, the kind of presence that could sit across from a widow liquidating her late husband's pension and leave her feeling cared for rather than processed. My own gifts ran differently. I was drawn from adolescence to the parts of the business nobody else in my family found remotely interesting: reconciliations, audit trails, the specific, unglamorous discipline of tracing a number backward until you found the exact point where it stopped telling the truth. I want to tell you about one memory from when I was 17 because it's the clearest early signal I ever received about what my role in this family was actually going to be. I'd spent that summer entirely on my own initiative, teaching myself to read the firm's quarterly compliance filings, cross-referencing them against client statements out of pure curiosity, the same way some teenagers take apart engines. I found a small discrepancy, nothing catastrophic, a minor reporting error in how certain advisory fees had been disclosed, and brought it, nervously, to my father's chief compliance officer, a careful older man named Mr. Okonkwo, who had worked for my grandfather. He was genuinely impressed, told my father directly that I had an instinct for this that takes most professionals 15 years to develop. My father thanked him, patted my shoulder, and then spent the rest of that dinner discussing which university business programs would put Julian in front of the right people early. I don't tell you this to paint my family as villains, not yet, not in this part of the story. I believe, even now, that my parents loved both of us. But there is a particular, quiet danger in a family business built around trust and charisma, where the child who reassures clients becomes the presumed face of the firm's future, while the child who actually understands where the numbers can go wrong gets gently, permanently filed under the compliance person. Valuable, in theory, but never once considered for the corner office. There's a second memory from that same period I've rarely told anyone outside of David, and I want to share it here because looking back with everything I now know, it reads almost like a warning I was too young to fully understand at the time. The winter I turned 18, I overheard my father and grandfather arguing in the firm's back office, a rare event given how carefully my grandfather guarded his own composure. My grandfather was insisting on a policy he called, simply, the Sunshine Rule. His belief that any advisory firm should be able to fully and immediately disclose every position in every client account to any client who asked, at any time, without a single moment of hesitation or preparation. My father, I remember, pushed back, arguing that certain quarters required managing the narrative a little for anxious clients, that full transparency in a down quarter could trigger unnecessary panic and unnecessary withdrawals that would only make a temporary loss permanent. My grandfather, in a voice I'd never heard him use before, said, "Edward, the day this firm starts managing narratives instead of disclosing truth is the day it stops being mine, whatever the paperwork says." I was 18 years old, standing in a hallway I wasn't supposed to be listening from, and I remember feeling a chill I couldn't fully name at the time, one I would not fully understand the weight of for another 17 years. I pursued my accounting and forensic fraud examination training specifically because I believed for years that I was preparing to eventually run compliance and risk oversight at Cross Wealth Management, protecting the firm my grandfather built from exactly the kind of quiet failures that eventually sink even well-intentioned advisory businesses. I told my father this plan explicitly more than once. During a long conversation this summer, I discovered the fee discrepancy in a detailed letter I wrote him during my second year of graduate study, outlining exactly how I hoped to eventually formalize the firm's internal audit function. I actually worked at the firm for 2 years after finishing my undergraduate degree in an entry-level compliance role before returning to graduate school for my forensic accounting credentials. And it is during those 2 years that something happened I would not fully understand the significance of until 7 years later, sitting in my own office with a federal filing deadline closing in on me. During that period, as a junior compliance associate, I had a standard authorization signature on file with the firm's back office systems, used to co-sign routine internal reconciliation reports. I left that role and that signature authorization still technically active in an old records system nobody had ever formally decommissioned, when I departed for graduate school. The actual decision about the firm's future leadership happened, as most significant decisions in my family seemed to, without me in the room. I learned about Julian's promotion to managing partner during a phone call in the spring of my final year of graduate study, delivered almost as an aside. "Oh, I should mention," my mother said, "your father's decided to make it official with Julian, managing partner, effective this summer. He's already the one every client wants to sit across from. It just makes sense." Asked what that meant for the compliance and audit function I'd explicitly told them I hoped to eventually lead. There was a pause, and then my mother said, "Vivian, darling, that's still so important, and we're grateful you care about it so much. But the firm needs a face, a leader clients trust in a room, and that's always been Julian's gift. You'll always have a place doing the important work behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, I want you to sit with that phrase because it is the exact phrase that 7 years later would very nearly cost me my professional license, my reputation, and possibly my freedom. I completed my CFE certification the following winter, one of the most rigorous credentials in forensic accounting, requiring years of qualifying experience and a notoriously difficult examination. I told my parents the exact date months in advance. They said they'd be there. Then, 3 weeks before the ceremony, my father decided to move Julian's managing partner announcement dinner to the exact same evening, at the exact same downtown building, 3 floors above where my own ceremony was being held, because a major client whose trust was critical to a large upcoming account transfer happened to be available that particular night. I stood in that banquet room, reading my mother's text message, and I felt something in me finish breaking that had been cracking slowly for nearly 2 decades. I did not cry. I remember looking around that modest room, 30 folding chairs, a simple podium, none of the polish or expense of the champagne reception happening 3 floors above, and thinking, with a strange, hollow clarity, that this room, small and unglamorous as it was, actually represented something my family's entire business claimed to value and had never once, in my experience, actually practiced, earned credibility, built slowly, verified rigorously, without any need for charm to dress it up. I accepted my certificate in front of a modest crowd that included my graduate advisor and 2 colleagues from my cohort, and 2 weeks later, I called my parents and told them, calmly, that I needed real distance from the family. My mother called it dramatic. My father said I'd always taken these things harder than necessary. I told them both I loved them, and I meant it, and then I stopped answering their calls. 7 years passed. I built a forensic accounting and fraud investigation firm, Meridian Forensic Group, specializing in exactly the discipline my own family had once quietly dismissed as behind-the-scenes work, investigating financial irregularities at investment advisory firms, often on behalf of state and federal regulators. I married a fellow forensic accountant named David Reyes, someone who understood, without ever needing it explained, exactly why a person could love a family and still need real distance from it at the same time. We built a life together grounded in the same quiet, methodical values I'd spent my whole childhood being told belonged in the back office rather than at the center of anything. I did not speak to my parents or to Julian for 7 years. On a Monday morning 7 years later, my office received a formal engagement request from the state securities regulator's enforcement division. A whistleblower, later identified as a former junior associate at Cross Wealth Management, had filed a detailed complaint alleging that the firm had, for at least 4 years, been using new client deposits to cover shortfalls in existing client accounts, concealing investment losses that should have been disclosed, and generating fabricated statements showing steady positive returns that did not reflect the firm's actual, deteriorating financial position. I remember exactly where I was when the engagement request first came through, standing in my kitchen on a Monday morning, coffee in hand, scrolling through the morning's emails on my phone before heading into the office, the same routine I'd followed hundreds of times before without a single one of those mornings ever preparing me for what this particular email actually contained. My assistant had flagged it as high priority, the way she flagged any regulatory engagement request, and I remember thinking, in the ordinary, unremarkable way you think about the start of any new case, that this looked like a fairly standard investment advisory fraud referral, the kind Meridian Forensic Group handled several times a year. I did not recognize the firm's name at first glance on the engagement letter. Cross Wealth Management is a common-sounding name, and the regulator's intake form listed only a case number and a general description. It was not until I opened the preliminary client roster, 40 minutes into reviewing the file, sitting now at my actual desk with my coffee gone cold beside me, and saw my own grandfather's name still listed as founder in the firm's regulatory filings, that I understood, with a cold, physical lurch, exactly what case had just landed on my desk. I remember setting my coffee mug down very carefully, my hand not entirely steady, and reading that founder's name 3 separate times, as though rereading it might somehow change what it said, some small, irrational part of me hoping, for just a moment, that I'd simply misread it, that this was some other Cross entirely, some coincidence of a common name rather than the family I'd spent 7 years building an entire life away from. I wanted to understand how serious this was, because this is not a story about a minor compliance gap or a favorable accounting interpretation. What the whistleblower alleged, and what my firm's initial review over the following 72 hours began to confirm, was a structure disturbingly close to a Ponzi scheme, not a single catastrophic fraud, but a slow, years-long pattern where investment losses that should have been disclosed to clients were instead concealed by using incoming deposits from newer clients, many of them recent retirees rolling over their entire pension savings to pay out fabricated returns to older clients, and keep the firm's reported performance numbers looking healthy. If the pattern I was seeing held up, it meant that Cross Wealth Management did not actually have anywhere close to the $400 million in client assets its statements claimed. It meant hundreds of retirees, People who trusted my grandfather's 60-year reputation were sitting on statements showing money that, in significant part, no longer existed, a fact none of them had any reason to suspect because every statement they'd ever received had told them otherwise, month after month, year after year, in numbers designed specifically to keep them from ever asking the one question that might have unraveled everything years earlier. I remember the specific, physical sensation of reading the whistleblower's original complaint in full for the first time, alone in my office after everyone else had gone home, the building quiet except for the hum of the HVAC system and the occasional distant sound of traffic outside. The complainant, a junior associate who had left the firm only 3 months earlier, described in careful, methodical detail a pattern he'd noticed almost by accident. A recurring discrepancy between the returns clients were shown on their quarterly statements and the actual trade confirmations sitting in the firm's back-office systems, discrepancies that, individually, could always be explained away as timing differences or rounding, but that, aggregated over years, told an entirely different
story.
He wrote, near the end of his complaint, that he didn't know exactly how deep the problem went, but that he knew it was deep enough that he couldn't keep working there and sleep at night. Reading that line, alone in my office at nearly midnight, I felt the first genuine chill of what would become the most intense 2 days of my professional life, a feeling I would come to recognize, hours later, as only the very beginning of it. I called David that night and told him everything, sitting on the edge of our bed with the lights still off, my voice steadier than I felt. He asked me the only question that mattered in that moment. Do you want to recuse yourself right now before you go any further? I told him I needed to think, and that night I barely slept, running through the ethical calculus over and over. I could withdraw immediately, disclosing the conflict and letting the regulator assign the case to another firm, or I could disclose the conflict and continue, under strict oversight, given how rare it was for any outside firm to already have this level of institutional knowledge about Cross Wealth Management's internal systems, knowledge that could genuinely accelerate protecting the retirees whose life savings were actively at risk while the fraud continued, uninterrupted. Every single day the investigation was delayed. I disclosed the conflict formally, in writing, the following morning, to both the regulator's chief enforcement counsel and to my own firm's ethics reviewer, laying out every relevant fact plainly, without omission or softening, because I understood, even in that first exhausted morning, that the integrity of everything that followed would depend entirely on how completely and how immediately I disclosed exactly what I knew. After a tense 2-hour conversation, the regulator made an unusual decision, one I want to walk you through carefully because it's central to everything that happened next. Given the scale of ongoing client harm, new deposits were still coming in weekly, meaning the fraud, if real, was actively continuing to draw in fresh retiree savings even as we spoke. And given that a full recusal would mean assigning the case to an outside firm with no prior familiarity with Cross Wealth Management's internal systems, costing potentially weeks of ramp-up time the regulator believed the situation could not afford, they authorized me to continue the investigation under a strict, independently monitored protocol. Every finding I produced would be reviewed and separately verified by a second, entirely unconnected forensic firm before being relied upon for any regulatory action. And I would have zero contact with my family throughout the investigation, with all communication routed exclusively through the regulator's enforcement counsel. I remember the enforcement counsel pausing near the end of that 2-hour call and asking me directly, "Are you certain you can do this objectively, Ms. Cross? I need you to actually sit with that question, not just answer it reflexively." I told her the truth, which was that I didn't know for certain, not with absolute confidence, but that I knew exactly what evidence-based, disciplined forensic work looked like, and I trusted the independent verification layer they were building into the protocol to catch anything my own judgment might miss, a safeguard I found myself grateful for more than once over the following 48 hours. She accepted that answer, and the clock formally began. They gave me 48 hours to produce an initial findings report sufficient to determine whether emergency action, freezing the firm's accounts before more client money could be diverted or destroyed, was warranted. 48 hours to determine whether my own family's 60-year-old firm was actively defrauding hundreds of retirees, in real time, while I worked. I want you to sit with the tension of that clock with me, because I lived inside it for 2 of the longest days of my professional life. Every hour that passed without emergency action meant another hour Julian's firm could continue accepting new deposits from clients who had no idea their money was, in significant part, propping up a structure that could collapse the moment withdrawals ever meaningfully exceeded new deposits. Every hour also meant another hour in which records could be altered, destroyed, or moved beyond the regulator's reach if anyone inside the firm realized an investigation was underway. I spent the first 6 hours of that 48-hour window doing what forensic accountants call a rapid reconciliation sweep, pulling every available client statement against the firm's actual custodial account records at the banks and clearing houses that physically held the underlying securities, looking for the gap between what clients were told they owned and what the firm could actually prove it held on their behalf. By hour 8, the gap was undeniable. The client statements, in aggregate, showed roughly $390 million in assets. Verified custodial records showed closer to $210 million, a gap of nearly $180 million unaccounted for, across a client base that included, according to the firm's own records, at least 60 clients over the age of 70 whose statements represented their entire retirement savings. I remember pausing, around hour 7, staring at a single spreadsheet row belonging to a client named Dorothy Feldman, age 81, whose quarterly statement showed a balance of just over $2 million, built up over 4 decades of careful saving and, according to the firm's own custodial records, actually holding closer to $900,000, a gap of more than half her reported retirement savings, sitting quietly on a screen in front of me while she almost certainly had no idea, at that exact moment, that anything was wrong. I want to be honest that this is the point in the investigation where the abstract financial crime I'd been trained for years to detect stopped feeling abstract at all. Every additional row I pulled had a name attached to it, a life attached to it, decades of trust in my own family's reputation attached to it, and every hour that clock kept running was another hour that trust was actively, silently, still being violated, one statement at a time, one retiree at a time, while I sat alone in an office trying to work fast enough to reach them before the damage grew any wider than it already had. It was during hour 11, deep into reviewing the firm's oldest internal reconciliation files, cross-referencing back nearly 6 years to establish exactly when the concealment pattern began, that I found the file that turned this from the worst case of my career into something that put my own name, my own license, and quite possibly my own freedom directly at risk. Buried in a folder of internal quarterly reconciliation sign-offs from 6 years earlier, from the exact period during my last months as a junior compliance associate before I left for graduate school, I found a signed authorization approving a set of adjustments that I could now see clearly with 7 years of forensic training behind me, represented one of the earliest documented instances of the concealment pattern, an internal transfer disguised as a routine reconciliation adjustment, precisely the kind of maneuver that, once repeated and scaled over 6 years, became the fraud I'd spent the last 11 hours uncovering. The signature on that authorization was mine. I sat completely still at my desk for what felt like several minutes, staring at a signature that, at first glance, genuinely looked like my own handwriting from that period of my life. My hands actually went cold. I want to walk you through exactly what went through my mind in that moment, because I think it's the most honest, human part of this entire story. For perhaps 90 seconds before my training took back over, I was simply afraid. Not afraid of Julian, not yet. Afraid in the most primal and immediate way of what it would mean if that signature was actually mine, some early junior-level authorization I'd signed without fully understanding what it enabled, years before I had the expertise to recognize the pattern it was quietly beginning. Every forensic accountant's worst nightmare is discovering that their own name is attached to the very fraud they've built a career investigating. I remember getting up from my desk and walking to the small kitchen area of my office, just to put physical distance between myself and that screen for a moment, my mind racing through every possible scenario, what it would mean for my license, for Meridian Forensic Group, for every case I'd ever worked if a state investigation somehow concluded that the very woman conducting the audit had, years earlier, participated in laying its foundation. I remember standing at that small sink, running cold water over my wrists the way my grandmother used to do when I was a child and couldn't calm down, forcing my breathing to slow, telling myself over and over the same sentence. Asterisk, look at the evidence the way you would look at anyone else's. Don't let fear write the conclusion before the facts do. Asterisk. Then my training did take back over, and I made myself look at the signature the way I would look at anyone else's, methodically, stripped of panic. I pulled 3 verified samples of my actual signature from that same period, my graduate school application, a notarized lease from that year, a signed employment form from my personnel file, and laid them beside the disputed authorization under a magnifying loupe. The forgery, once I looked at it with real forensic attention rather than raw fear, was actually quite good but not perfect. My genuine signature, from that period of my life, had a distinctive, slightly looping lift on the final letter of my surname, a habit left over from a childhood handwriting workbook my own grandmother had once made me practice from. The signature on the authorization document was missing that lift entirely, replaced with a flatter, more deliberate stroke, the kind of small, telling inconsistency that separates a careful forgery from a genuine signature, visible only to someone trained specifically to look for it, or someone who had spent an entire childhood signing her own name exactly the same distinctive way, thousands of times, without ever once thinking about it. I photographed every page of that document from 6 different angles under controlled lighting, logged the exact time and method of discovery in a forensic chain of custody log, and made 3 separate, independently hashed digital copies before I allowed myself to feel even a fraction of relief. Only then, sitting back in my chair at nearly 2 in the morning, did the full weight of what I'd just found actually settle over me. Someone inside Cross Wealth Management had used my old, still technically active signature authorization from my junior compliance days to backdate legitimacy onto one of the earliest instances of the fraud, years after I had already left the firm. And I had no idea in that moment whether it had been done carelessly, by someone who simply needed any old authorized name in the system, or deliberately, by someone who understood exactly whose name would provide the most useful cover if the fraud was ever discovered. Regulatory protocol was explicit. No contact with my family during the investigation. Everything routed through Enforcement Counsel. I called Enforcement Counsel first, immediately, disclosed exactly what I'd found, and requested formal guidance. She confirmed the forged signature discovery needed to be documented meticulously and preserved as evidence, and, critically, she told me something that raised the stakes of the entire investigation even further. Given that I now had documentation potentially implicating me personally in the fraud, however falsely, the regulator's office needed to move even faster than originally planned, because if my forged signature was discovered by anyone at Cross Wealth Management first, there was a real risk that whoever forged it would move immediately to destroy the broader evidentiary trail before I could complete a defensible, court-ready reconstruction of the fraud's full 6-year history. I remember sitting with the phone still warm in my hand after that call ended, looking at the clock on my office wall reading well past midnight, feeling something shift inside the investigation itself. This was no longer simply a race to protect client funds. It was now, simultaneously, a race to protect my own name, my own license, my entire career, from a document sitting in a file cabinet 3 floors below where my parents had once toasted champagne to my brother's promotion while I received a certificate down the hall alone. 18 hours into the 48-hour window, with that warning still fresh, my personal cell phone rang. Not my office line, not a number the regulator would have used. Julian's number, unblocked from a burner contact I'd apparently never fully deleted, 7 years later. I should not have answered. Every piece of my professional training told me not to answer. I answered anyway, and I want to be honest with you about why. Some old, stubborn, still hurting part of me needed, immediately, to know whether he already knew I was the one investigating him. Vivian. Julian's voice was tight, controlled in a way I didn't recognize from the easy, charming brother I remembered. I need to talk to you. Not as an investigator. As my sister. Julian. I can't be on this call, I said, my own voice flat, professional, even as my heart was pounding. You need to have counsel reach out to the regulator's enforcement division directly. I have to hang up right now. Vivian, please. Just 30 seconds. I know you found something with an old signature file. Dad's compliance assistant flagged an access log this afternoon showing someone pulled records from 6 years back, and I put it together fast because I know how you think. I always have. I need you to understand something before this goes any further, and I need you to understand it from me, not from a report. I should have hung up. I have replayed many times since exactly why I didn't, and I think the honest answer is that some part of me, even after 7 years, still needed to hear what he was about to say. I didn't forge that signature to hurt you, he said, his voice dropping lower, faster now, like he knew he had a narrow window before I'd end the call. 6 years ago, when you left for graduate school, there was already a hole in the numbers. Not from me. From Dad. He'd made a bad concentrated bet on a single position years before either of us had any real authority, lost a huge chunk of a major pension client's account, and instead of disclosing it the way Grandpa always would have, he decided to quietly cover it using new deposits, just temporarily, just until the market corrected, he told me. I was 23, Vivian. I just started. He told me your old signature authorization was still technically active in the system, and that using it for one adjustment, just once, would buy us time without either of us technically lying on the record ourselves. He said it wouldn't ever come up again. I believed him. I was wrong. It became the way we survived every bad quarter after that for 6 years, and I have hated every single day of it, and I didn't know how to stop it without destroying everything Grandpa built, and everything Dad's whole identity was built on. And Vivian, I need you to hear this part specifically. If this comes out the way it's about to come out in 48 hours with federal and state regulators both involved, Dad is going to try to make it look like it was your idea from the start. Because your signature is the earliest one on record, and he still has the original access logs from your compliance days, and he already has our family's attorney drafting a narrative where you left the firm specifically because you were the one who initiated the concealment and got scared and ran. I sat in complete silence for several seconds, feeling something colder than fear settle into my chest, a strange, almost physical stillness, like the entire room around me had gone quiet at once. Every instinct I had wanted to interrupt him, to demand proof, to ask a dozen forensic questions at once about dates and documents and who else knew. I forced myself to simply listen, to let him finish, because some part of my training understood, even in that moment, that an unguarded confession delivered under pressure was worth infinitely more, evidentially, than anything I could extract through questioning. Julian, I said finally. Are you telling me our father is planning to frame me for a fraud he started? I'm telling you, Julian said, and for the first time in the whole call, his voice cracked, that I have 48 hours to decide whether I let that happen to protect him, or whether I finally do the one thing I should have done 6 years ago and hand you everything, all of it, every real record, before he has a chance to destroy what's left or finish building a story that puts it all on you. I hung up that call, hands shaking, and immediately did 2 things, in the exact order my training told me to. First, I called enforcement counsel and disclosed the entire conversation, verbatim, as required. An unauthorized contact from a subject of an active investigation, disclosed immediately and completely, is very different, legally and ethically, from a concealed one, and I was not going to let anything about my own conduct in this investigation be anything less than perfectly clean. Second, I asked her the single most urgent question of the entire case. How quickly could the regulator secure an emergency preservation order for Cross Wealth Management's physical and digital records, given what I'd just disclosed about a possible active destruction risk? She told me the earliest a judge could realistically sign an emergency order, given the paperwork involved, was roughly 14 hours out, meaning there was a genuine window, roughly half a day, during which records at Cross Wealth Management were legally unprotected and, based on what Julian had just told me, potentially actively at risk. I spent the next 6 hours in the most intense, focused work of my entire career, racing to complete a defensible, fully documented reconstruction of the fraud's origin and scope using only the records I had already secured, copied, and hashed with a forensic timestamp before Julian's call. Records that, crucially, could no longer be altered or destroyed even if someone at Cross Wealth Management attempted it in the coming hours, because I already possessed verified, time-stamped copies outside the firm's own systems. I built a complete chain of custody documentation proving exactly when and how I had obtained each file, establish the forensic basis for the forged signature finding with full photographic and typographic analysis, and prepared a formal declaration for Enforcement Council establishing, in careful, methodical detail, that the earliest instance of concealment predated my departure from any decision-making role at the firm by 6 years, using date-stamped system access logs I had, fortunately, already pulled and secured during my very first hours on the case, before Julian or anyone else could have known an investigation was even underway. I remember the specific, almost physical exhaustion of those 6 hours, working alone in my office as the city outside my window slowly went from full darkness to the first gray edges of dawn, coffee gone cold beside me, my hands moving almost mechanically between spreadsheets and declaration drafts, while some quieter part of my mind kept circling back, again and again, to the same unanswerable question. Was my own father, at that exact moment, somewhere across the city, deciding whether to destroy the evidence of 6 years of fraud, or deciding whether to finish building a story that would end with his own daughter's career and freedom instead of his own? I did not know the answer, and not knowing it, hour after hour, was its own particular kind of exhausting fear, one that had nothing to do with the physical evidence in front of me, and everything to do with a lifetime spent never quite knowing what my own father actually thought of me. I only knew that every file I secured, every declaration I finished, every hour that passed without a call telling me records had already been destroyed, mattered more than almost anything I had ever worked on in my career. At hour 31, 4 hours before the emergency preservation order was set to be signed, Enforcement Council called me with an update that made my stomach drop. Cross Wealth Management's IT vendor had logged an unusual, large-volume data export request from an internal administrative account late that evening, nearly 600 gigabytes of archived records, requested for transfer to an external drive, flagged automatically by the vendor's routine security monitoring precisely because of its unusual size and timing. Someone, somewhere inside my family's firm, was actively trying to move records off the premises before the emergency order could freeze them in place, at exactly the moment I least had the time or the margin to absorb another crisis on top of the one I was already racing against. I called Julian back myself, breaking protocol for the second time that night because there was no time left to route through counsel and I needed an answer immediately. "Is that you?" I said, the moment he picked up, my voice tighter than I intended, pulling 600 gigabytes of records right now. There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear my own pulse in my ears while I waited. "It's not me," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "It's Dad. He's here right now at the office. I came in to try to stop him, and Vivian, he's genuinely panicking. He's talking about moving files to a drive he's keeping at the house, says he needs time to get the story straight before anyone comes in with a warrant. I don't think he fully understands yet that this isn't something a story can fix anymore." I could hear, faintly, in the background of the call, what sounded like a filing cabinet drawer sliding shut, and then my father's voice, muffled but unmistakable, saying something I couldn't quite make out, followed by Julian's voice, pulled slightly away from the phone, saying, "Dad, put it down, just give me 1 second." Before he came back to me, his breathing audibly faster than it had been a moment earlier. "Julian, listen to me very carefully," I said, "and I want you to notice, even in the middle of the single most frightening professional moment of my life, that my voice did not rise, did not shake, stayed level in a way that surprised even me in the moment, because somewhere in the last 31 hours, the fear I'd felt looking at that forged signature had converted itself, almost entirely, into something colder and more useful. If your father physically removes a single file from that building tonight, it becomes evidence tampering and obstruction on top of everything else, and it will not just be his problem anymore, it will become yours the moment you knew about it and didn't stop it. I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Do not touch the export. Do not physically remove anything from the premises. If your father tries to leave with a drive, do not try to stop him physically. Call the number I'm about to text you right now. It's a direct line to Enforcement Council's after-hours desk, and tell them exactly what you just told me." "And what happens to him?" Julian asked, his voice cracking slightly. "If I do that?" I sat with that question for a moment, feeling, even then, some old, complicated ache underneath the adrenaline, because whatever my father had done, he was still my father, and some small, unerased part of a lifetime of wanting him to finally see me clearly did not simply disappear because I now held, quite possibly, the single piece of evidence that could end his freedom. I could hear, in the background of the call, my father's voice rising slightly, something that sounded like, "Julian, who are you talking to?" and Julian's muffled response, moving further away from the phone, buying himself distance. "I don't know exactly what happens to him, Julian," I said honestly. "That's not my decision to make, and it never was. But I know what happens if you don't call, which is that hundreds of retirees keep losing money they can't get back. Every single day this continues, and you become someone who chose to protect our father over protecting them, the same way he once chose to protect the firm's reputation over telling them the truth. I can't make that choice for you. I can only tell you which one I made 7 years ago, when I finally stopped waiting for this family to choose me back." There was a long silence on the line, filled only with the faint, distant sound of my father's voice, still audible somewhere in the background, and then Julian said, quietly, "Okay, I'm calling them now." And he hung up. I sat alone in my office after that call ended, phone still in my hand, the city outside my window fully dark, and realized my own hands were shaking for the first time since the entire investigation had begun. I did not sleep at all during the final 14 hours before the emergency preservation order was signed. I spent them on a continuous call with enforcement counsel, walking through my findings in exhaustive detail, preparing the formal declaration that would accompany the emergency filing, and coordinating with the second, independently retained forensic firm brought in overnight to verify my findings before they could be relied upon in any court filing, exactly as the original protocol had required. At 6:14 that morning, a state judge signed the emergency preservation and asset freeze order for Cross Wealth Management, roughly 41 hours after the investigation had first landed on my desk. Enforcement agents arrived at the firm's offices at 7 a.m., securing physical and digital records before the business day could even begin, freezing the firm's operating and client accounts to prevent any further movement of funds while the full investigation proceeded. I was not present for that raid, by design. As the investigator who had disclosed a personal conflict, I remained entirely outside the physical execution of the order, receiving updates only through enforcement counsel, exactly as protocol required. I remember sitting in my kitchen that morning, David beside me, both of us in silence, watching the clock tick past 7 o'clock, then 7:15, then 7:30, waiting for a phone call that would tell me whether the order had arrived in time, or whether, sometime in the previous 6 hours, my father had found another way to move what he needed to move before agents ever reached the building. The call came at 7:52 a.m. Enforcement counsel's voice, when she finally reached me, sounded, for the first time in the entire investigation, something close to relieved. The external drive Julian had described was still sitting, untouched, in my father's desk drawer, exactly where it had been left after Julian's call to the after-hours line the night before. My father had been advised, over the phone, not to leave the premises with it, and, whether out of genuine compliance, exhaustion, or simply the slow, dawning recognition that there was no longer any version of this story he could control, he hadn't tried. My father was not arrested that morning. The investigation, at that stage, was civil and regulatory rather than criminal, though enforcement counsel confirmed, in the weeks that followed, that the scope and duration of the fraud made a parallel criminal referral to federal prosecutors extremely likely. What had happened that morning was this. Agents recovered the external drive, along with the firm's complete physical and digital records, before the business day had even properly begun, before a single client walking through the door that morning could have any idea that everything they believed about their own retirement savings was about to change. The independent verification firm confirmed my findings in full within 5 days, a fraud spanning just over 6 years, concealing losses that had grown from an initial $11 million to a final gap of approximately $181 million in unaccounted client assets, the earliest instance of concealment dated to a period 6 years and 2 months prior to the investigation, conclusively before my departure from any operational role at the firm, and conclusively initiated, time-stamped, and documented beyond dispute by my father, using my old, dormant signature authorization without my knowledge or consent, exactly as Julian had described to me, in a rushed, frightened phone call, in the middle of the night, 18 hours into a countdown neither of us had ever expected to find ourselves living through together. I was formally cleared of any involvement within 8 days, a finding Enforcement Counsel confirmed to me personally, in a conversation I remember with a strange, quiet relief unlike anything else in this entire story. Not triumph, not vindication exactly, just the simple, enormous relief of watching the truth arrive, fully documented, exactly where the evidence had always actually pointed. I want to pause the drama of this story for a moment because I think what happened next matters more than anything involving my own family. The state regulator, working alongside a court-appointed receiver, spent the following months unwinding Cross Wealth Management's remaining assets, working to recover as much as possible for the roughly 600 clients affected. Because the freeze order came before any further client withdrawals could accelerate the collapse, and because my 48-hour reconstruction gave the receiver a clear, fully documented map of exactly where remaining assets actually were rather than where statements claimed they should be, the eventual recovery rate for affected clients came in at approximately 61 cents on every dollar of the actual shortfall. A genuinely devastating loss for many retirees, but meaningfully higher than the near total loss that typically follows a fraud of this scale and duration once it's allowed to fully collapse under its own weight before anyone intervenes. I received, some months later, a letter from Dorothy Feldman, the 81-year-old client whose statement I had stared at during hour 7 of that first long night, the one that had made the abstraction of the fraud suddenly, unbearably concrete. She had recovered, in the end, just over $550,000 of her original $900,000 in actual custodial assets, a serious, life-altering loss, one that meant selling her home and moving in with her daughter, she wrote, but a loss she survived, financially, in a way she told me she wasn't certain she would have if the fraud had been allowed to continue even a few more months. She wrote, near the end of her letter, "I don't know your name would have meant anything to me before all this, but I want you to know it means something now. I have kept that letter in the top drawer of my desk ever since, not as a trophy, but as a quiet, physical reminder of exactly what those 48 hours actually cost and exactly what they actually protected. I think about those 61 cents often. I think about the alternative version of this story, the one where I recuse myself the moment I recognize my family's name on that engagement letter, where a different, unfamiliar firm spends 3 additional weeks simply learning Cross Wealth Management's internal systems before making any real progress, weeks during which new deposits kept arriving and the underlying asset shortfall kept widening. I don't know exactly how much of that recovery rate exists because I stayed on the case despite the conflict, working under strict independent oversight, rather than walking away the moment it became personally dangerous to continue. I know it matters more to me than almost anything else in this entire story. My father was indicted 11 months later on federal securities fraud and wire fraud charges. He ultimately pled guilty to a reduced set of charges as part of a cooperation agreement, avoiding trial, and was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, with a restitution order attached requiring the surrender of nearly all remaining personal assets toward the client recovery fund. My mother was never criminally charged, though she lost her own modest retirement accounts, which had been held at the firm and were included in the same asset shortfall as every other client's. I attended the sentencing hearing, 7 years to the month after I'd stopped answering my parents' calls, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, a place I never once imagined I would find myself the day I first accepted a certificate down the hall from my own family's celebration. My father did not look at me during the proceeding, not once, though I watched him carefully throughout, searching, I think, for some final sign of the man who had once patted my shoulder over a fee discrepancy and told me I had an instinct that took most professionals 15 years to develop. I did not find that man in the courtroom that day. I found, instead, someone smaller than I remembered, someone whose careful, practiced confidence had finally, completely run out of road. My mother sat beside him throughout, her hand on his arm, and afterward, in the hallway outside the courtroom, she approached me for the first time since the investigation began. She didn't apologize, not exactly. She said, simply, I don't think I ever let myself see what he was actually doing all those years. I think some part of me didn't want to know. I told her I believed that was probably true, and that I thought it was, in its own way, its own kind of failure, one she would have to sit with in whatever way she needed to in her own time without my help carrying it any further than that hallway. We have spoken only a handful of times since. Julian was not criminally charged. His cooperation, the call to enforcement council that stopped the record destruction in progress, and his subsequent full cooperation throughout the investigation, providing detailed testimony about the fraud's mechanics and history, was formally credited by federal prosecutors as instrumental to both the criminal case against our father and the client recovery effort. He was barred from the securities industry for life through a regulatory settlement and Cross Wealth Management. The firm our grandfather spent 60 years building was formally dissolved 18 months after the investigation began. I spoke to Julian for the first time outside of the investigation itself about 4 months after our father's sentencing. He called, this time through proper channels, no longer a subject of an active investigation, simply my brother calling his sister. I don't know how to ever make this right, he said. Any of it. What Dad did. What I let happen for 6 years because I didn't know how to stop it without destroying everything. Using your name without asking. All those years ago, when I was young enough to convince myself it wouldn't matter. I told him, honestly, that I didn't think there was a single conversation that could make 6 years of fraud and one forged signature simply right again, and that I didn't think he should expect one, from me or from anyone else. There was a long silence on the line after I said that, and I could hear him breathing, unsteady, on the other end. I used to tell myself all those years that I was protecting the family, he finally said. I think what I was actually protecting was the version of myself that got to keep being the one everyone liked, the one who never had to be the bearer of bad news. I think some part of me always knew that was a coward's math, and I let myself do it anyway for 6 years, because being liked felt safer than being honest. I didn't have a ready response to that either. It was, in its own way, one of the more honest things anyone in my family had ever said to me. I told him that the phone call he made at 2 a.m., the one that stopped our father from walking out of that building with an external drive, the one that meaningfully changed the outcome for 600 retirees and, not incidentally for me, that phone call was real, and it mattered, and it was the first time in either of our lives that he had chosen the harder, less charming, more honest path over the easier one. We talk occasionally now, carefully, both of us aware of how much ground still sits unaddressed between us. It is not close. I don't know if it ever fully will be. But it is honest. In a way almost nothing in my family ever was before those 48 hours forced all of us to finally look directly at what we'd built. I want to be honest about what this story is not, because even now, with everything that happened, I think that honesty matters more than a dramatic ending. This was not a story where I discovered a smoking gun and enjoyed watching my family's world collapse. I never once, through any of it, felt anything close to satisfaction watching my father face what he'd built. What I felt, more than anything else, was a kind of exhausted, unglamorous relief. The relief of a job done as correctly and as fast as it was humanly possible to do it, under conditions that would have broken most people, with real, quantifiable stakes for hundreds of strangers who had never once heard my name before their retirement savings depended on how quickly I could work. I've thought, many times since, about what would have happened if I'd simply recused myself the moment I recognized the firm's name, the safe and unquestionably correct professional choice available to me in that very first hour. I don't regret that I didn't. But I also don't think the version of this story where I stayed on the case is a triumphant one, exactly. It's a story about a woman who spent 35 years being quietly told her particular gift belonged behind the scenes, discovering, in the worst 48 hours of her life, that behind the scenes was exactly where the truth had been hiding the entire time, waiting for someone with the specific, unglamorous skill to go looking for it. I've also thought a great deal about the 90 seconds of pure fear I felt staring at that forged signature before my training took back over, and I think that moment matters as much as anything else in the story. Real courage, I've come to believe, isn't the absence of that fear. It's what happens in the 91st second, when you make yourself look at the evidence clearly anyway, when you make yourself do the careful, unglamorous work of proving the truth instead of simply reacting to the fear of what might be false. I don't think I would have survived those 48 hours if I hadn't spent years, long before any of this happened, training myself to trust process over panic, evidence over instinct, even when the evidence in question had my own name written across the top of it. I didn't need a 48-hour countdown to know my own worth. I'd known it for years, in every case before this one where the stakes were lower and nobody in my family was watching. But there is a difference between knowing your worth privately for yourself and discovering, in the single most dangerous moment of your career, that the exact expertise your family once quietly dismissed is the only thing standing between hundreds of people and a total, irreversible loss. That discovery, not the sentencing, not even the phone call from Julian months later, that was the real center of this story. Everything else was simply what happened once the 48 hours finally, exhaustingly, came to an end. That's the whole story. Thank you for staying with me through every hour of it. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own quieter kind of expertise nobody quite knew how to value until it mattered most, I hope you know what nearly cost me everything to learn. Sometimes the people who overlook you are standing on ground far more fragile than they ever let you see, and the moment it cracks, your calm, careful, unglamorous skill is the only thing that can hold the truth together long enough for anyone else to see it too. I want to leave you with one final thought before I go, because I think it matters more than the drama of the countdown itself. In the months since all of this happened, I've thought often about the exact moment the tone of this entire story shifted. Not the moment I found the fraud, and not even the moment I found the forged signature, but the 90 seconds afterward, when fear had every opportunity to write my next move for me, and something older and steadier, something built over years of unglamorous, overlooked work, quietly took the pen back instead. I think that's the part of this story I most want anyone listening to actually carry with them. Not the 48 hours. Not the countdown. The 90 seconds where you decide, under real pressure, which version of yourself is actually going to answer. If you made it this far, tell me in the comments, would you have stayed on the case, or walked away the moment you saw your family's name? I read every single one, and after a story like this, I mean that more than ever. I'll see you in the next one.